You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Anne Lene Stein, a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at Lund University in Sweden. With a background in both social anthropology and peace and conflict studies, Anna's research over the past 10 years has focused on peace activism in Israel, Palestine and Lebanon, among other places. She's particularly interested in protest and resistance in asymmetrical conflict settings and has conducted several rounds of fieldwork in the region to understand better how different peace movements have been operating and evolving. Her most recent visits to Israel and Palestine were in summer 2023, before the latest tragic escalation in the conflict. While there, she talked with both Palestinian and Israeli peace campaigners and anti-occupation activists, and observed joint Israeli-Palestinian protests and commemoration events. In the wake of Hamas's brutal attacks on Israeli civilians on October the 7th, and Israel's sustained bombing of Gaza over the following weeks, peace in the region looks further away than ever, but work towards peace is all the more urgent. The Visualising War and Peace project continues to repeat calls for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages as urgent steps in preventing further loss of life. And we urge politicians all around the world to redouble their efforts to establish conditions that will enable both Palestinians and Israelis to recover from these devastating events and begin the slow, challenging work of rebuilding for a better, more peaceful future. Anna, these are clearly troubling times in which to talk about this, but I'm keen to ask you how people have been visualising peace in Israel and Palestine in recent years, and also how those visions and peace campaigning might be impacted now by recent events. But before we dive into your research, let me first welcome you to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. Many thanks for taking time to talk to me today.
Hello, and thanks so much for having me today.
So I wonder, Anna, if we can begin with you giving us, first of all, a brief overview of the different kinds of peace movement that have been active in Israel over the last decade or so. Are there lots of different groups? Are some particularly dominant? Have some gained particular momentum?
Yes, of course. I think in order to answer your questions, we will need to go back a bit in time to actually understand how peace work or peace activism, peace movements in Israel and Palestine are operating. Because Israel has been seeing many grassroots peace building initiatives since the start of the occupation in 1967. However, I think we can actually observe that in the 1980s, there was the heyday of the Israeli peace movement, so to say, which was very much represented by groups like Peace Now, who could back then really easily mobilize 100,000 people. That is a number that's very impressive, considering the overall population size of Israel, and also when we think about how many people actually nowadays go to these protests and events. But the term that was used back in the 1980s in the peace movement was a lot about co-resistance. The people were kind of co-resistant the occupation. They were co-resistant against further settlement, buildings, and so on. But then with the outbreak of the first Intifada, like the first non-violent popular Palestinian uprising in the end of the 1980s, the peace movement kind of collapsed a bit because they did not really follow up with the events that were unfolding with the first Intifada. So they kind of lost momentum there. But then with the start of the peace process, or the so-called peace process in the 1990s, the peace movement came back on the agenda. They kind of re-emerged, particularly in the years following 1993 and the Oslo Accords. But now it was not that much about co-resistance anymore. It was much more about coexistence, meaning creating that impression that the political aspect of the conflict has been solved with the Oslo Accords, and now all that is left is actually the individual hostility, the us versus them framing that needs to be worked on. So there were a lot of people-to-people projects that Palestinians, but also a lot of Israelis from these peace movement actually participated in. But then, a couple of years later, we have the outbreak of the second Intifada, right, with a lot of violence that broke out in the West Bank, but also in Israel and also in the Palestinian communities inside Israel. And the peace movement, again, kind of missed the momentum here, and particularly to stand in solidarity with their Palestinian partners on both sides of the Green Line, so on both sides of the West Bank territories, but also within Israel. And that is why a lot of scholars actually say that there is not a peace movement in Israel, or rather that the peace movement in Israel has been in crisis for many, many years, basically, since the Second Intifada. But I think what is also important to mention is that this kind of mainstream peace movement that goes back to the 1980s and that is very much represented by groups like Peace Now that are still active, is that they reflect a very Zionist ideology, which then kind of like leads to the fact that they not really reflect on the discriminatory effects that their Zionist ideology or their like Jewish state paradigm actually has on their Palestinian partners. So they have a very Jewish bias in a sense that they only Israelis in their peace movement, they have no Palestinians on their board or as members, and they only address a Jewish audience, so they're not addressing a Palestinian audience. And they have a historical bias in the sense that they very little acknowledge 1948, but they rather see the start of the conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict with 1967, with the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and back then Sinai. And in that sense, they're kind of unwilling to confront the history from a standpoint of the oppressed. And that is like one of the main rifts that go through the peace movements nowadays, also to kind of define where actually is the starting point of the conflict. Is it in 1948 with the creation of the Israeli state, or is it in 1967 with the start of the occupation?
So, Anna, there's clearly a very complex history, as you've just outlined there, of peace activism, shaped, unsurprisingly, by different phases of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. I wonder if you can now just bring us up to date with today by giving us a short overview of the kinds of peace activism that people have been pursuing most recently in Israel and Palestine, involving both Israelis and Palestinians.
We can roughly divide the peace work in Israel in two camps. The one is the work that's related to 1948, but that is peace work that is directed towards the Arab-Jewish relations within Israel. So it's about coexistence within the borders of Israel. It's about micro-level problems of fear between Israeli and Palestinians who are living in these kind of so-called mixed communities. It's about socioeconomic inequalities and struggle for full civic rights. And then we have the second camp that is related to 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So they are advocate for an end to the occupation and the settlements. And I think here we have activists that divide themselves along generational differences, how much they're influenced by Zionism, how they relate themselves to 1948 and 1967 and so on. And then, of course, you have binational peace movements. There are not that many, but those are actually movements or organization groups that consist of Palestinian and of Israelis. I think two groups that are dominating this kind of landscape right now are the Parent Circle Family Forum and the Combatants for Peace, who are very outspoken, very vocal about their engagement. They organize joint events, both in Palestine but also in Israel. And they're often from both sides accused of being traitors, collaborators, and for the Palestinians in particularly as being normalizers. People who are the activists in these two groups, they pay a really high cost for their engagement and for their activism. And then, of course, we have a lot of Palestinian peace activism. And I think here we can see also, again, a plurality of different actors with different interests, but all aim to end the occupation, I think, in a nutshell. But they differ a lot in their way to go about it. So, for example, we see that there are many Palestinians are very disappointed with the Palestinian Authority and the leadership under Mahmoud Abbas. So they engage in activism inside Palestine for political change. But then you also have, for example, feminist groups who are very outspoken and active in their pursuit for women's rights, saying that we actually have to focus on women's liberation before Palestine can be liberated. But then you have a lot of groups who argue that the most important fight is the fight against the occupation and everything else needs to wait until Palestine is liberated. So there's the way we go about the liberation is just, it differs a lot. And I also talked to activists in the West Banks who are very creative in their activism. So they organize exhibitions, public performances. And what they do is they do not necessarily talk about peace, but they address the everyday living conditions and in what ways, or make visible in what ways they're actually influenced by the occupation. And they aim to kind of educate their own society, like the Palestinians, in them to empower them and make them more aware of different kind of injustices, for example, and how they can go about that. I think a lot of these groups actually do not cooperate with Israel or do not address an Israel audience, but rather aim to address an international community to then put pressure on Israel, or they work with their own community. You have organizations that work with Israel, but again, they're often accused of being normalizers and being kind of pushed to like the outside of their own community. And then you have groups that only cooperate with Israelis if those Israelis actually agree to the Palestinians' conditions. So, for example, that they only work with Israelis who openly acknowledging the Nakba, the 1948 catastrophes for the Palestinians, who are very openly and outspoken to address power asymmetries in the relations.
You've sketched a really fascinating history there of a very, very complex landscape of so many different kinds of peace movement that have evolved over time and that vary enormously from place to place in terms of the kinds of audience they are trying to engage with, the kinds of tactics that they employ, and the kinds of issues that they're campaigning on. Women's rights, for example, everyday living conditions, economic equality, anti-occupation, Arab-Jewish relations, all sorts of different issues that different groups are tackling. So a very complex landscape. But what kind of responses have they had over the years from wider society, from people who are not involved in these different movements?
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect because I think, especially for the Israeli society, I would say that we see that the space for civil society and for peace and anti-occupation activism has been constantly shrinking over the past decades within Israel. It started a bit with the Second Intifada, but it's kind of like the space is shrinking since then. And I think it's interesting because Israel in itself is very much a land of protest. So when I was there, like every single week, there are protests and demonstrations and marches against all kind of things that are happening all the time, right? And then you have these events like, for example, when I was there, it was like 55 years of occupation is enough. Then it's like 56 years of occupation is enough protests. You have these anti-war protests that always erupt when there are military escalations between Israel and Hamas or Islamic Jihad in Gaza normally. And at the first sight, it also always looks like there are many people attending these protests. But when you go to these different protests, you realize after a while that you see the same people all over again. So it's just like an illusion of a lot of people, even if there are lots of people in numbers, it's same people again and again. It's actually a minority within Israel. So these days where they mobilized 100,000 people, they are long gone. So now they maybe 1,000 when they're lucky. It's a minority. Even though they're a minority, they get more and more attacked. And that's what I meant when I said the space is shrinking nowadays. And they get attacked by both the government, but also by the wider society. And there are severe efforts to silence actually these critical voices in Israel. We have seen very aggressive campaigns against human rights organizations and peace activists in the past 10, 15 years. And I think it's important to understand that this also happens in connection with laws and initiatives, official laws that also aim at silencing critical voices in Israel. So voices, for example, that challenge the official self-image of the Jewish state and the dominant interpretation of its history. And an example here is the Nakba law of March 2011, which says that public funding is to be withdrawn from any organization that concurs with the Palestinian narrative that the Israeli struggle for independence was actually also responsible for the forcible displacement of Palestinians, or any kind of organization that participates in associated commemorations. Because the Israelis, they're always celebrating their Day of Independence in May, and at the same time, the Palestinians commemorate the Nakba, the day of where they lost their home or their homeland. So that is one example. But we also have other examples like the anti-BDS law from 2017 that actually allows to prevent individuals who participate in the boycott of Israel or its settlements to enter the country. So there are plenty of government initiatives that aims to silence critical voices. And this has an impact on the wider society, of course, and that you can also see in concrete terms in how this kind of activism has been, like the peace or anti-occupation activism, has been met with a lot of hostility from the society. So an example here is there's this joint alternative memorial ceremony that commemorates the life of Palestinian and Israelis who were victims of war and terror. It's happening since 2006 every year. It's quite radical because it commemorates the loss of Palestinians and Israelis. or maybe let's say it's controversial, as it happens on the same day as the Israelis officially commemorate their own victims. When they organize these events in Tel Aviv, and there are always counter protests against the joint commemoration. And those counter protests also go so far that a couple of years back, people told me actually that they got spit on. When they were attending the ceremony, people spit on them. So they're also being physically assaulted. And it seems to be deemed okay to actually spit on people when they go to commemorate people they lost. Or this year, when I was at the ceremony, you had the counter protest outside, and you constantly heard the counter protesting yelling, traitors, collaborators, terrorists, waving huge Israeli flags, aiming on disrupting the commemoration of Palestinian and Israeli lives. And I know that the Palestinians who actually participated in that event, they were very much afraid of leaving the event because they did not know what they would actually encounter outside. Or another example is an attended protest. People were actually saying, well, you have to be a bit careful because when these right-wing counter-protesters see you too often, and then they're going to see you outside of these events again, they will maybe harass you.
Thanks, Anna. So yes, you've painted a very worrying picture of this shrinking space for peace activism within Israel, and some of that is due to top-down measures that might introduce laws that make certain kinds of protest, certain kinds of activity more difficult, or funding more difficult to achieve, but also some hostility from a kind of wider portion of society through counter-protests and through ongoing harassment even away from the site of protest. And you mentioned earlier as well that Palestinians engaging in some parts of the peace movement sometimes again are tarred with these labels of collaborator, of traitor, accused of normalizing relations and so on. Clearly, these protests, these anti-occupation protests, these peace movements are operating in a context of huge power asymmetries. You've told us a little bit about the different tactics that different peace movements adopt, from exhibitions to demonstrations and a whole range of other commemoration events and co-commemoration events and so on. Can you tell us a little bit more about how people committed to campaigning for peace manage this hostile environment and these asymmetries in power, what tactics they employ to try and keep campaigning despite the challenges?
Yeah, of course. So let's start again with the Israeli side and then move on to the Palestinians. I think we also see different tactics from the Israeli side. I mentioned already protest marches. I mean, they're very prominent in Tel Aviv, in a very open, liberal city. You have a lot of performances, from groups like Seeing the Occupation in the Eyes, who stand on bridges on the main highways once a day per week with signs aiming to raise awareness about the occupation. They also face a lot of resistance actually by people driving by. You have the Women in Black vigils every Friday in Jerusalem. So you have a lot of activities from these groups happening, mainly actually in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but also in different other places in Israel. But what I think is super interesting when it comes to power asymmetries and different tactics is actually this kind of solidarity activism that I have mentioned before. For example, when it comes to these house evictions in the East Jerusalem neighborhoods, where Palestinians face constant threats of evictions, these activists, they volunteer to kind of support these families, but they only show up when they're asked to do so by their Palestinian partners. So they would never really show up without being asked to do so, because they know that sometimes it's difficult for those Palestinian families to then be accused of normalization if they cooperate with their Israeli partners, but also sometimes they just don't want the Israelis being involved, right? So they always just become active by demand, so to say. And also there are these protests that are happening. I mean, now they're pausing, but for years in one of the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, they're Friday protests where they're protesting against the evictions. And most of these protesters are actually Israelis, but nevertheless, it's Palestinian-led because they want the Palestinians to be in charge and to be in power in kind of controlling the situation. And that is something I think that is a bit more novel in these kind of partnerships between Israelis and Palestinians. But what I think is also super interesting here is that the Israelis actually using their privileges to protect their Palestinian partners. So, for example, in these protests, but also in other situations when they go to the West Bank or so, these activists would use their bodies to shelter Palestinians from being arrested or to being violated by the police or by settlers. because they know if they go and get arrested, like the Israelis, they will be released quite soon because they're still Israeli citizens. So they have all these rights that come with the citizenship. But if the Palestinians get arrested, you don't know what will happen. They even like maybe be like killed in the whole process. So they're actually actively using their privileges. They're using their bodies to put themselves out there to protect their partners and to kind of like support their struggle against the occupation and the settler violence. And I think a second observation in these kind of activism or these kind of group is that these activists are not only protesting against the occupation or for peace, but they're rather engaged in a whole kind of set of intersectional activism, so to say. So they participate in different struggles also within the Israeli society. So they participate, for example, in the Pride Parade in Jerusalem. They participate in events against violence against women, against sexism, racism, in support of rape victims. So you see the same activists all over again. But what they do is actually they link these different fights together, and then they bring the occupation into the conversation. So, for example, at the Pride Parade in Jerusalem, they had the slogan, "You cannot pinkwash the occupation." So they advocate for an understanding that sexism, racism, and patriarchy are all connected to occupation and all kind of the same root causes. And I think that's a generational difference that is rather new, because when you look at these like older peace organizations, it's only the fight against the occupation, the fight against the settlements, but it's not linked. It's very like isolated. And then, I mean, binational activism, as we talked about, I think in these groups, people are also very aware of power imbalances. And they try to address this by giving more space, more room for Palestinians. But also both of these groups, they very deliberately work in their own communities against hatred stereotypes. And then they try to build a foundation upon which they can actually meet. So, for example, the group Combatants for Peace, they have a freedom school only for Palestinians that really aim to empower young people in the West Bank. And they talk a lot about the occupation, but they also talk about internal struggles, like that only affects Palestinians. And then so they have these huge topics. And after that, they kind of asked, are you ready to meet Israelis? So they have actually an option. Like it's not necessary in these programs that they meet at the end, but you have the room to decide whether or not you want to do that. And I think on the other hand, you have a lot of Israelis who really try to change the dominant discourse to kind of bring back the Palestinian and the Palestinian issue back to the Israeli society. And then, of course, you have a lot of Palestinian activism. However, I think their repertoire tactics are much more limited, as they are active from this position of oppression and occupation. So there's no much space for protesting, for example. Protest is most often suppressed by the Israeli army right away or by the Palestinian Authority. They also do not want any kind of opposition against them. But again, I think you have a lot of internal activism that is then directed towards empowering and liberating the Palestinian communities. Events, for example, that remind people of their Palestinian heritage or broader connection to the Arab world. Again, advocating towards women's rights, freedom of expression, political participation.
A common term used to describe this kind of Palestinian non-violent resistance against Israel's occupation and the struggle against ethnic cleansing is sumud, which is Arabic and means steadfastness. And sumud can take on various forms, from investing in education, for example, or investing in economic projects in Palestine with the aim to strengthen self-reliance, but also, as I already have mentioned, arranging cultural activities or activist campaigns. But it can also mean to be determined to live as normally as possible. And in that way, our resistance becomes a way of life, but also the body serves as a site from which resistance actually emerges.
Again, it's much more under pressure and dangerous than to do so from the Israeli side. And maybe I can mention an example here of Palestinian activism, the Al-Basta Theater. And when I was there this year, they were participating in, it's called the Super Melon Festival. And they combine art, activism, and food to kind of raise awareness about food injustice and resistance for political change, but also to acknowledge the essential role of women in holding and cultivating this knowledge. And as part of this festival, Al-Basta actually organized a very interactive performance to explore the use of food as a tool of control, but also resistance in the context of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. And the audience was only Palestinian, but I think it was very powerful because it talks about the occupation, it talks about injustice, it talks about women's rights. So it addresses a whole range of injustices at the same time and creates the knowledge about it and a space to talk and to share these experiences. And so from conversations with Palestinians, I learned that they view these joint protests in Palestinian villages, for example, in the West Bank, as something very comfortable for the Israelis to participate in, because they say it's so much easier for them, for the Israeli activists, to actually talk to Palestinians with whom they actually share a common cause, like they're against the occupation, they're against settler violence, etc., than to talk to their own society, to talk to their own friends and families. So the Palestinians I talk to, they often insist that the Israelis, they should turn their focus towards their own society and they should start working at home. So I think that is a lot how Palestinian activism understands Israeli peace activism.
You've given us a really good range there of the very, very different kinds of peace activism happening within Israel, within Palestine, in binational movements as well. The variety, the creativity, the intersectionality of some of that activism that also connect up with women's rights movements, with anti-racism activism, all sorts of other human rights issues. Just thinking a little bit more about binational peace activism, have you found any particularly successful examples of that? Or is that perhaps the most challenged space of all for peace activism between Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, I think it's very, very challenging. We talked about it, right? It's so complicated because of this accusation of being traitors, collaborators, normalizers, etc. So it's very, very challenging. It's not supported much. I think it's fascinating because we do still see these collaborations. We see them within Israel with like the Standing Together movement that brings together Jewish and Palestinian citizens very successfully. Even now, as I said, they're doing very important work. Then again, you have these collaborations in like the Parent Circle or the Combatants for Peace that I mentioned before as well. And I think even though they face so much resistance, they continue organizing these events, these joint events, and they're successful in the terms that the numbers of attendees are raising from year to year. Started with, probably like 80 people in the beginning. I don't know, that is like a made up number, but like a very, very low amount of people actually coming in 2006. And I think when I was there this year, it was like 15,000 people attending, mostly Israelis, internationals, but also Palestinians. And then they also broadcasted. So they have a huge international audience, which is also important because it's important to raise awareness also on an international scale, not only in Israel and Palestine, I think. And then you have these collaborations in East Jerusalem that I talked about, where you have the solidarity activism helping to prevent families from being evicted and helping people with settler violence and soldier violence in the West Bank. They're on a small scale, but I do think they have an impact. And I do think they're important, even though they're on a small scale. But I think even this like joint memorial ceremony in Tel Aviv, for example, since it's growing from year to year, I think there is a potential there to change the discourse because they're introducing a new narrative into the mainstream Israeli discourse. And even if they're faced with resistance, they are very troubling. They're creating an uncomfortable feeling. And I think maybe in the long term, they will achieve that maybe the narrative starts to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for all of the challenges, for example, the complex negotiation of when it is not actually constructively helpful, let's say for Israeli activists to stand with Palestinians in East Jerusalem, for example, that's not always a given. For all of those complexities, you're seeing some progress, some success, and I'm particularly interested that that's perhaps focusing around this idea of changing the narrative, changing discourses, reducing the traction that dominant discourses have, making people less comfortable with those dominant discourses. And of course, that's something that, as you said, has to happen within individual communities, but also actually very much between them. I guess that brings me on to a few other questions. So you've talked a little bit about the fact that some current peace activists actually are talking more about ending the occupation and thinking more in terms of ending the occupation, addressing the occupation, than actually visualizing peace, than resolving the kind of the bigger situation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about the different kinds of conflict resolution which different peace activists in Israel and Palestine are visualizing here?
I remember a quote of one of my interviewees, and he says that when I asked him about why do you talk about anti-occupation, not about peace, he said it's very important to talk about occupation because peace is also talked about by the right and by the center, which has a completely different implication. If we say peace, we don't know what it means, but if we say kibush, which is the Hebrew word for occupation, we actually burn people's ears because it's something that people don't want to hear. So that's why we also use the word, because it's like much more provocative, it's much more troubling, it's much more uncomfortable. And I think that's a very important statement.
Yeah, and it gets us thinking about the power of individual words. So the challenges presented by the words peace, but the language that peace activists might otherwise lean into, that, as your interviewee put it, might burn people's ears more productively than, let's say, the word peace. So in visualizing peace, we might lean to all sorts of metaphors, different kinds of language, which help us visualize a future, perhaps in more productive, more powerful ways.
I think this differentiation, whether you find yourself as anti-occupation activist or a peace activist, also has a lot to do that peace is very contested. The term peace in Israel is a very contested one. And I just heard someone saying now it's also become a very radical one. I mean, now people don't dare to talk about peace anymore. But I think what is being often overlooked is how little we actually give consideration to what the term peace actually means to Israeli and Palestinians. And that says a lot about the conflict resolution that comes within, because they tend to have different views on what peace actually is. And they also, like, particularly for the Palestinians, they see peace as a bit of a dirty word, given the failure of the Oslo peace process. So for Israel, I think peace is very much connected to security, while for the Palestinians, peace is connected to justice. And then I think it's worth going back to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, because I think they're still influencing how we see peace and understand peace or imagine peace nowadays. Because for the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords have been a legitimization for the Israeli occupation. The peace that actually was achieved through the Oslo Accords, that came with a worsening of the social, economic, and political situation for the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And it had no meaning whatsoever in the sense of justice. Instead, we have, like, the Palestinians experienced a decline in the economy, the establishment of more checkpoints, more houses demolished, new settlements were built, etc. So the situation worsened with the Oslo and the peace that it was supposed to bring, right? So I think that's why a lot of Palestinian organizations often avoid using the term peace when they describe their own work. So you're not necessarily, I mean, you find organizations using the word peace, but I think it's striking that a lot of organizations, groups, activists would not use the word peace in the Palestinian society. I think that's a bit in a nutshell why peace is so contested for the Palestinian, and why it's so much easier in that sense also to work against the occupation, because it's also like very goal oriented in that sense. And I think for most Israelis, Oslo has been seen as a success, particularly by the mainstream peace movement, like, again, Peace Now, for example, because the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, they recognized Israel, and the PLO was recognized by Israel, and there was an affirmation to the two-state solution, something that these peace movements, these mainstream peace movements, were advocating for. But in general, I think peace is very much associated with security, in the sense of secured borders, without a threat of terrorism and invasion, and a normalized relation with the neighboring states. And I think that's something that we can see now in the discourse as well, when people talk about Hamas and Gaza and saying the Israeli government cannot guarantee a secure and peace under the current situation in Gaza, right? So this, like, securitized discourse is very strong when it comes to peace in the Israeli society.
So really important observations there about these differing conceptions of peace, as security, as justice, real divergence of understandings of what peace might mean to different people, different individuals, different communities, and the word peace itself becoming a dirty word, as you say, becoming a barrier, anti-occupation activism feeling somehow more tangible. As people who study peace, this is obviously very challenging, but very, very important to wrestle with. In a recent article, you did write about this. You quote an Israeli activist saying, the Israelis lost the ability to imagine peace because here people lost the imagination of another reality. And, you know, that comment predates the events of October the 7th and suggests quite a sustained decline in people's ability to imagine or visualize peace and imagine and visualize a better future. But as you've been suggesting, you know, of course, events since October the 7th have made that imagination, that visualization, both all the more urgent and all the more challenging, with a kind of deepening of the rhetoric of securitization on the one hand, different people weighing in on ideas about the two-state solution on another hand, and so on. Do you think that talking about peace, that people will continue to talk past each other a lot when they're talking about peace as we try to unravel the devastation of recent events? Do you think that peace is in itself continue to be a really contested concept, all the more so? Do you see any hope, any pathways through here? Of course, we know that some of the people killed in Hamas's attacks on October the 7th and in Israel's bombing of Gaza since were key figures in the peace movement on both sides. So again, that's another challenge going forward. What difference do you think that might make to the future of peace activism in Israel and Palestine?
I think what we kind of see from the past, the scale of escalation, the scale of people being killed now, right, is like unprecedented. But there have been escalations between Hamas and Israel before. We have seen all kinds of like violent events in Israel and Palestine in the past. And what we also have seen after that is that the organizations who worked for peace or against the occupation, they always seem to be even more committed to the activism after something has happened. So they come out again, they speak out as one of the first, and they kind of reaffirm their commitment to peace and to end the occupation. And that's the same at the moment as well. I mean, it took a bit of time, but not that much for like organizations like Breaking the Silence, Sukkot, the Combatants for Peace, Iramim. They all like released statements where they reaffirmed their commitment to peace. But at the same time also calling an end to the violence in Gaza, saying that there's no justification for like killing innocent Palestinian people, while acknowledging that what Hamas did on the October 7th is horrible. It's a horrible attack. So they condemn the violence from both sides, right? And that's a good example of how these organizations, although they also suffer losses themselves, actually reaffirm their commitment to peace. And I think maybe because it's one of the examples that I know best is the Combatants for Peace, that binational grassroots movement that I talked about earlier. Because right after the attack, they organized meetings on Zoom between Israelis and Palestinians, like the core of the movement, so to say, where they gave each other space to mourn, but also to find each other again. And to renew their commitment. And they did that on Zoom because, of course, Palestinians are not allowed to travel into Israel, and it's difficult for the Israelis to travel even now into the occupied territories where they're legally allowed to go. So they met on Zoom, and then they gave each other space. And I think that's a very impressive, very important initiative that is going on. And another good example is actually these demonstrations against the war. It's something that normally always happens as soon as there's an escalation between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Israel, for example, that you have demonstrations in the major Israeli cities that like demand an end to the violence. And they are happening again. It took a bit of time because, of course, there were still missiles being shot from out of Gaza into Israel. So it was much more difficult to organize these demonstrations. But now in the past weeks, we see that people coming out, people protesting again against the war, asking for like the return of the hostages, of course, as well, but also to stop this unjustified killing of Palestinian citizens, women, kids, children, babies. But I think it's important to mention that they again face massive opposition from the civil society, but also state-based. And it became increasingly dangerous for these activists to speak out against the war in Gaza or to speak out in favor for peace. And we also see that Jewish Israeli activists, but also Palestinian citizens have been arrested on account of publicly displaying signs of opposition against the government and in support of Gaza. A lot of people are actually fear that they will be arrested for their activism. In that way, it's very hard to say what the future brings, but it's important to highlight, I think, that there are still these people, these voices out there advocating for their peace, anti-occupation activism, whatever you want to call it, and that we don't neglect these voices because they also want to be heard.
You know, are taking great risks to be heard in an increasingly hostile environment, but an increasingly urgent situation. So you've helped us think about the fact that peace is being talked about and visualized less in certain contexts. And that, of course, might ultimately mean that it's less likely to come about. If we visualize something less, then we might work towards it less successfully. That said, as you've pointed out, we have to keep interrogating what different people mean by peace. One person's idea of peace might not be another person's. So thinking about the different metaphors that people use, the different peace imaginaries that are on the ground, that are present, that are being discussed, and then all these different methods as well. And together with your colleague, Lisa Strombaum, you have recently published an article on something called agonistic peace. As you argue, an assumption at the heart of most peace processes and peace agreements is that all parties will find some kind of consensus. And the conversation you've taken us through today shows just how challenging that is in this particular context. This idea that everyone is building towards consensus leaves little space, as you put it, for passions, conflict, and contestation, which are inevitable constants in the aftermath of conflict. And in your article, you're interested in exploring how agonism and contestation could, in fact, be written into peace agreements or peace processes. And as you write, leave imprints on peace-building efforts in post-accord societies. I wonder if you can say just a little bit more about this idea of agonistic peace and help us think through how it might help us imagine future peace processes too.
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the most important contribution of agonistic peace is actually that it encourages us to rethink the meaning of conflict. And by that also kind of invites us to repoliticize the idea of what peace actually is in the work we do as researchers. Because an agonistic understanding of peace departs from a perspective that conflict should actually not be eradicated, that it should be continued in a political and non-violent way. And in that sense, it reverses the idea that conflicts are inherently bad and should be avoided, and that kind of societal harmony or consensus is the end goal of every peace-building initiative. So agonistic peace actually tells us conflict can prevail, but we should find strategies, institutions, so that it's played out in a constructive way. So I think in a nutshell, one could say it's about disagreeing without demonization. It's a kind of an utopian vision for social relationships that are characterized by disagreement. So again, agonism is about relations between adversaries and not between enemies. And these adversaries that, while acknowledging their differences and the lack that there might never be a rational solution to their conflict, nevertheless recognizes the legitimacy and presence of their opponent, and also recognizes the shared political and symbolic space they actually interact. And I think a very helpful distinction here is the one that is theoretical framework does between agonism and antagonism, where agonism is understood as a very inclusive situation of mutual existence based on plurality and recognition of difference, while antagonism, on the other hand, is an exclusive situation, which is based on opposed identities that can only be manifest solely as one at the expense of the other. So there can't be adversary relations in that. And I think for me, when I use agonistic peace, it's in the end about creating space for continued contestations and to be able to hold different truths at the same time. And I think that's very challenging. But a good example here, in the case of Israel-Palestine, is the narratives around 1948, which is as for the Israelis, always this Israeli independence, and for the Palestinian, the Nakba, the Palestinian national trauma. And as it is remembered at the moment, it's very exclusive. The focus is very much on victimization, and thus creates a lot of fear and enemy images from which it is very difficult to actually look forward from. But it kind of resembles a very antagonistic conflict, right? And when you would take an agonistic perspective into that, you would say that the aim of any peace-building process should not be to reconcile these two narratives, but to allow for spaces of contestations where both narratives have a space to exist, can be disseminated, and perhaps also can be contested. But importantly, they are both recognized and acknowledged in that space. Yeah, so maybe make it even a bit more concrete. In my current research, I look into different forms of protest and dissent from Israelis and Palestinians, and I use this agonistic perspective to actually look at this. And I'm interested in how protest performances actually deal with the other or the enemy, respectively with the Palestinians or the Israelis in epistemically contested situations, in these situations where we actually deal about how do we understand 1948, 1967, and settler colonialism, apartheid, occupation? And what kind of utopian imaginations of the future and also about peace are actually expressed in these performances? So, for example, the protest performance that I observed, that I would also label as agonistic in the sense that they kind of renegotiate the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians in terms of adversary and contestation. They also create space for kind of having a new idea of how like a political community could look like, where both groups are actually part of. However, I think it's very important to see that, as we talked about, they have met with a lot of opposition and counter-protests, and these are often very violent. The body language of those people participating in those counter-protests are very aggressive. So what we can learn, I think, is when we give space for agonism, it kind of can backfire and creates even more antagonism. And also not only antagonism against or towards Palestinian, but also antagonism towards the own Israeli society, kind of like creating troubles for the social cohesion within their own society, right? So I think that's something we should be aware of when we think about agonism and antagonism for peace processes. But it also tells us something about how peace and reconciliation within the Israeli society actually valued at the moment. And I don't think they're not valued in the highest terms, right? With that being said, I think it's also important to mention that agonistic peace comes with certain problems. I don't think it's suitable as a theory that maps on reality. It's inherently based on theoretical thinking. It's very complex, it's very abstract, and it's also very idealistic in one way to understand, in its understanding of how peace should actually be understood. And it comes with theoretical weaknesses, as it does not account for any kind of asymmetry power relations, which I think we need to take into consideration when we deal with Israel-Palestine in particular. And then if we use the agonistic framework, agonism puts a lot of demands on the subject, because if you imagine you need to participate in these kinds of encounters where you acknowledge the opponent's understanding, etc. So it asks a lot of you to participate in that. And I think if you do not acknowledge these kind of power asymmetries in the concrete Palestinian case, one could even say that asking for agonism demands from the Palestinian subject to actually accept to some extent their own oppression to make agonism possible in the first place. So I think that is important to think about if we think about implications of agonism for peace processes. But I think as a framework to think through, it can be very helpful to like design spaces that are more inclusive, more agonistic, and to kind of remember that we need spaces for contestation and for allowing for plurality of truth at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. So it has its problems, it has its challenges. As you say, it doesn't necessarily map onto reality. It's actually in some ways utopian in its thinking, but it is a really useful way, not only of visualizing peace differently, but visualizing peace processes, as you say, getting us to think about the difference between disagreement and demonization, the difference between adversary and enemy, the difference between agonism and antagonism, and really getting us to think about how different stories can sit alongside each other. You know, history, and particularly the history of conflicts, tends to be a real tangle, a very messy tangle of competing, conflicting stories of different people's experiences, of different people's perspectives on those experiences. And that's true of nowhere perhaps more than of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, and the sort of emotional attachment that people have to these narratives and these histories of their own experiences. And just recognizing that in order to move forward, demolishing one person's set of stories, sidelining another's, is never going to be successful, that we have to find some way to navigate the multiple truths of all sorts of storytelling and all sorts of history and experience, so that it is a very useful tool to think with, even if it's not actually a very applicable tool. Many, many more Palestinians internally displaced from their homes. The current estimate is around 80% of the population in Gaza has been internally displaced. Of course, many people killed brutally and thousands traumatized in multiple ways. And as we've discussed, this latest escalation in conflict between Israel and Palestine is a real threat to very long-running peace movements, very long-running peace activism. We've got peace activists who are testifying to you that events have really challenged their desire for peace. In a recent article, you quote one anti-occupation activist as saying, for example, in the New York Times, I know it's not noble of me, I know there's suffering on the other side, but the other side took hostages and slaughtered so violently and with so much passion that my compassion is now somehow paralyzed. So we've seen the ways in which these recent events and current events have really shaken the peace movement and led to questions about whether or not it has any future. But on the basis that words and stories are world building, and that we can make more progress towards peace by visualizing it in all its complexity, it might be good to end on some more hopeful reflections. So in a recent article, you cite a couple of peace activists whose words do remind us to resist narratives of violence and division and visualize alternative pathways. I don't know if you want to read those quotations out for us.
Sure, I think they're super important. So it's my pleasure. So the first quote comes from Noy Katzman, and he said that quite soon after he received news that his brother Hayim was killed by Hamas fighters, and both of them described themselves as belonging to the peace and anti-occupation movement. And he said in a CNN interview, the most important thing for me and also for my brother is that his death will not be used as a justification for killing innocent people. And Noy, like many other activists, are now targeted in their own communities for their refusal to see the other side as the enemy. And the second quote then comes from a Palestinian activist, Mai Shaheen, who said in a webinar, this violent system keeps trying to tell us that is the only way. Calling on each other's Palestinian and Israeli during these times is so hard because it is breaking the system. It will break if we start meeting, partnering, taking action. We will break the cycle.
Thank you. And that last quotation there does remind us that there's so much pushing people towards violence, that systems in place, structures in place keep reinforcing certain narratives that violence, securitization, that retaliation, retribution are the only way, but that there are ways of breaking that cycle. And that involves dialogue, partnering, as she put it, taking action and visualizing peace and peacemaking in different ways. Anna, thank you so much for sharing your research with us on such an important topic. Unfortunately, such a topical issue at the moment. Our hearts are very much with everyone who is suffering, everyone who has suffered in Israel and Palestine, and everyone who continues to do so. And just want to reiterate our call for a permanent ceasefire so that people can actually start partnering again, taking action again, breaking the cycle of violence and moving towards a better and more peaceful future. Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Anna.
Thank you very much for having me on this very important podcast.
And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have more episodes coming up over the winter as we continue to explore different experiences of conflict and peace building in different periods and places. So please do keep tuning in. If you would like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review if you can. It helps people find the show. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.